This conference will now be recorded.
And now that we've got the official wording that we are being recorded, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. I hope everyone is safe, healthy, and well. My name is John Melby. I've had an interesting journey over about the last 8 years. Around 2012, I was taking a CSCP class, and that's when I really kind of started participating in my APICS chapter up here in the Twin Cities. And at the same time, I went to the APICS convention or conference in Denver that year, and I heard Carol Patak and Chad Smith talk about demand driven. And I thought at the time, it's an interesting concept. I'm going to keep an eye on it, maybe read about it. Looked like maybe something we should pay attention to. So I completed my CSCP and I started following demand driven, and I completed a couple of certifications there. And in the meantime, I became an instructor for APICS and found out that that's one of my passions as well. And I asked Carol and Chad at the Demand Driven Institute if they needed any instructors, and they said, sure, why not? Little did they know. So I, in fact, became an instructor for the Demand Driven Planner in February of 2017, and I have added the Demand Driven Leader. There's a Demand Driven S&OP experience workshop, and most recently the DD Bricks Factory, which is a hands-on Lego simulation to try and explain this stuff. And basically, I've been spreading the word about Demand Driven MRP and what I consider the wide range of advantages to embracing the demand-driven methodology in your business and helping people to stop managing chaos and start driving progress. About a year and a half ago, ASCM announced that they supported and endorsed and partnered with the Demand Driven Institute. And so I was able to start my own company called Become Demand Driven. And that is where my focus is today, as well as I'm the president of the APICS Twin Cities organization up here in Minneapolis. So I want to start today maybe with where often we would end, but I want to start with talking about the challenges and the advantages of following this methodology. So visibility, right? We have been trying to focus on visibility and figure out how we can improve visibility. And we have been focused almost entirely on forecast accuracy. And in my opinion, wrongly thinking that that is the only visibility that we need. The other part about visibility is it's hard to tell if what we're doing to fix problems is actually fixing the problems. At least in my experience, we would try and make some changes, and maybe at the end of the month, you could get the metric for return on or days on hand of inventory, and that's, told you that, but it didn't give you anything about whether you fixed the problem on that particular part. So visibility on, are my actions actually fixing the problem I'm trying to solve, is a little bit of a different take on visibility. Velocity. Some of you are going to recognize the 3 V's here as we go through them, but the pace of change, I don't think anybody believes that change is slowing down. We keep trying to match the increasingly demanding customer expectations by using a system that was designed for a world when we had plenty of time, right? MRP came about in the 60s and 70s when lead time was not 3 hours, it was maybe 3 weeks or 3 months. And customers expect fast responses every time they make a change, not just when they place an order, but when they make a change as well. And then variability, right? We have expectation versus reality. And when we have to make adjustments because our expectation seldom lines up with the reality we find, that creates chaos. And it's not really a surprise. We put a wrong number, a knowingly wrong forecast number into a precision system, and then we constantly have to adjust it. And it's not working so well. So the premise behind, or one of the premises behind demand driven, is that it's better to be roughly right rather than precisely wrong. Now, when we talk about the symptoms, what do we face? In every business I've ever talked to anybody about, we have a problem with inventory. We have a problem with customer service. We're running overtime, constantly rescheduling. Not sure if our vendor is going to be able to provide the product when we need it. Air freight, expedited freight, and then of course employee morale. I bump into people who say the main reason that they want to tackle and embrace demand driven is because they're tired of people crying when they're leaving work every night. And that's a huge frustration. So one of the things about this is, and I've said this for years, doing the wrong things faster is not a good solution. And I liken it to, if you've ever driven in a neighborhood where they have a lot of little dead end cul-de-sac roads, and you can see the house you're trying to get to, but you're not on the right road. And but you feel like you're just so close. And if you could just get yourself on the right road, it's easy to get there. But from the wrong road, it's virtually impossible. So my question to you is, are we ready to explore a new direction for a solution? And the beautiful thing about this, what we're talking about today, is that it's a methodology, not a recipe. So this is not a one size fits all. This is a few pieces of innovation that if you embrace those, you still have to fit it into your business. In other words, a distribution company is not going to apply exactly the same as a manufacturing company. So it's a methodology. It has a lot of pieces to it, and it applies to every business. Now, here's why I can say that. Camelot Management Consultants put together the results from companies that have embraced the demand-driven methodology. And what you can see is across multiple industries, you get different results, but you get results across different industries. Service level increase, right? There's a local company up here in Minneapolis, went from about 40% on-time delivery to over 80% on-time delivery. And at the same time, they would have done better, but they at the same time increased their business by 20%. Lead time reduction, right? It's one of the things we fight, and one of the things we'll talk about today. Improving your lead time. If your customer is not willing to wait more than 3 days, then you have to somehow have a 3-day lead time and be able to react to that. Inventory reduction. How many of us are killing ourselves to reduce 1, 2, or 3%? On average, in all industries, on average, it's a 30% reduction in inventory. And I used to tell people, take that with a grain of salt. Let's call it 10%. Let's call it 15%. But in fact, it's case after case after case that it's around 30% reduction in inventory. And the company I mentioned that went from 40% to 80% on-time delivery, they went from 10.5 million to 7.5 million at the same time. Guess what? It's about 30%. So while you're reducing inventory, increasing your service level goes against everything we learn in APICS and everything we learn about statistics, right? But there's a little piece to that adds some interest to it. So I say, it sounds too good to be true. I say it's too good to ignore. How is it possible? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. But let me just ask one question. If you have too much of the wrong inventory and too little of the right inventory, why are we all focused on only cutting inventory? If there is something that we don't have enough of, cutting it is not going to help. We have to actually increase that one. And it's one of the big impacts of demand driven MRP is to help us see which items we're short of. I used to walk into stock rooms and people would say, we don't really keep inventory. And I'd say, what's all this in the stock room? Well, that's inventory. And I said, all right, well, which ones do you have too much of and which ones do you have too little of? And the answer is nobody could ever tell me, because like myself and probably most of you, we find out about our problems when they happen. I'd walk into work in the morning and I would learn about the problems we were having after they happened. And that is way too late for me to fix it. Sorry, that's way too late for me to prevent it. All I have left is to try and fix it. And then the chaos begins. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk a little bit about a change in focus on flow and emphasizing flow over cost. And then we're going to introduce demand-driven MRP. And then we're going to talk about really the 4 innovations of DDMRP, along with the big innovation, which is just the packaging and putting it all together into a methodology. So why do we emphasize flow? Flow, in fact, is the determinant of success. Why? Because when flow is occurring, service is consistent and reliable, revenue maximized and protected, inventories are minimized for the business, not minimized without regard to the fact that you still need inventory. Expenses, both ancillary and unnecessary, are minimized, and cash flow follows the rate of product flow to market demand. So what we end up with is a new way to think, which is if we protect and promote flow, we will maximize our return on investment. Now, how do we explain what flow is? Very simple equation, but flow is the rate at which a system converts material to product that is required by a customer, right? When we talk about flow, we talk about systemic flow, not how fast you can put a product that nobody wants through a machining center. How fast do we convert material to a product required by a customer? Cash velocity is the rate of net cash generation. And net profit divided by investment is, in fact, the equation for return on investment. Now, we can quantify flow as well. And if you want to dig deep into this, there's a whole bunch of material out there on something called Little's Law. And so we can say throughput times lead time equals WIP. And with mathematics, we can solve for any of the 3 variables. If we know 2 of them, we can solve for the 3rd. But the important piece here is what we call the company vitals. And let's just talk about a similar situation, right? If you go into the emergency room, they check 3 things. They check your heart rate or your pulse or your blood pressure, some measure of your heart rate. They check your temperature, and they check if you're breathing, don't they? If any one of those 3 is outside the normal expectations or very far outside the normal expectations, you get to go to the front of the line. You get help right away. It's the same thing with a company. You have 3 vital signs: your working capital, your contribution margin, and your customer base. If you have a great contribution margin and a lot of working capital, and you don't have any customers, you need some help. And if the contribution margin isn't there, you're selling all kinds of stuff, but your margin is very small, you're also not making a return on investment. So we want to keep all 3 of these company vitals in that center spot, and flow is how we do that. And the interesting thing is, the better things flow, the better controlled costs will be in any particular period. However, when you focus solely on reducing costs, you will increase costs. And that's really hard for people to get their head wrapped around. But if you focus on improving flow, then costs will be controlled and minimized. Now, what else do we know about flow? Flow is one of the common objectives of MRP. We want to synchronize demand and supply. And we do it because we want to flow the product from raw materials through to finished product. What about lean? We want to reduce waste. Well, if we reduce waste, we've also improved flow. Theory of constraints, improved system throughput. What's another word for throughput? Flow. And Six Sigma, we want to reduce variability. If we have standardized processes and similar results every time we do those processes, well, we improve our flow. So all of the methodologies that are being used for in companies today are all focused on flow. And then there's another piece called Plossel's Law. George Plossel was one of the original three that put MRP together. Right? All benefits will be directly related to the speed of flow of materials and information. But we have a bit of a challenge to flow. Have you heard of the VUCA world? That is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it certainly is all of those things, isn't it? When MRP was being discovered, let's call it, in 1965, it looks very different than the way it looks today. And I won't go through all of these. Supply chain complexity is certainly there. And in today's world that we live in is showing us that everything is interrelated. There is no island of production. Customer tolerance time. Today, customers are not willing to wait, myself included. Product complexity, customization, variety, all very high. We have long lead time parts today. Forecast accuracy, not so good anymore. Pressure for leaner inventories. I know we can't raise our hands, but usually I say at this point, anybody not facing pressure for leaner inventories, right? Every company is facing pressure. And then the last one is transactional friction, which has two parts to it, really. But when I was a kid, we would get a catalog in the mail with an order form in it, and we would have to fill out that order form, transcribe the product we want, the codes and the pricing, and put that all perfectly on an order form. We would have to write a check and put it in with the order form. We put it in a little white envelope with a stamp on it, and then we would have to walk out to the end of our driveway, and there was a big silver tube out there that we would put that letter in. And sometime in the next 12 to 24 hours, a magician would come along and take that letter where it needed to go. And what did we have to do? We had to wait 6 to 8 weeks for delivery, which was always nice because 6 to 8 weeks later, I got a surprise because I couldn't remember that I even ordered that stuff. So what do we have today? Amazon Prime, one click. How hard is it to order something? One click. But the other side of transactional friction is how hard is it to find a new supplier? Right? In the old days, you have to use a Thomas Register and sort through books looking for what you're trying to find. In today's world, 6 letters, isn't it? Google. And in 3 hours, maybe 6 hours, you can have a pretty good short list of suppliers that you can then interview and choose between. So it's much easier to purchase things, and it's much easier to find a new place to purchase. Now, something is fundamentally broken today. And before I jump into this too far, MRP is still valid. No one is suggesting that MRP is not valid. However, the world around us has changed, and we have to make some adjustments because MRP has some basic prerequisites and assumptions, like you will have plenty of time, your materials will always be ready when you need them, and nothing will ever go wrong. And those are not as valid as they used to be. So something is fundamentally broken. I think we can all agree that we have two universal points of inventory. Point A, where we have too little, and point B, where we have too much. And it stands to reason that somewhere in between those 2 points is just right. And that's where we want to be. You know, one of our APICS meetings about 5 years ago, we had the meteorologist from one of the TV channels come and speak to us. And when we set it up, I signed up, I went, but I thought, I'm not going to learn anything from this thing, but it should be fun, right? That was the point, to have some fun. Well, what's interesting to me is the first words out of her mouth were, when we get to the TV station, as a meteorologist, the first thing we do is check the current conditions. And I thought, good grief, that's what I need. I need a way when I am at work to check my current inventory conditions. And from this graphic, can you imagine if we had an optimal range and we had a warning system that would tell us when we were getting to too much, and we had a warning system when we got close to too little? We could do something about it before the emergency happened. And that is one of the most powerful slides, and at least from my experience, that really lets me know that this system has something to it. And MRP, the way MRP works is it tries to drive you to have nothing left over. So it wants to live in that range very close to too little. But that's not where we want to live as buyers and planners and ops managers. So the reality is, most companies face what we call the bimodal distribution. We have a lot of parts in that too little range, and a lot of parts up in that too much range, and almost no parts in the optimal range. And nobody's happy. And every time MRP runs, with all the changes that have happened, parts move from being in the too little side to being in the too much side. And because we are not focused on trying to maintain the optimal range, we're waiting until we get down to our safety stock, and then we're placing an order to get us out of trouble that puts us over to the other side. And 90% of companies report this issue. So what are the three bottom line effects to companies because of this? We have chronic shortages at the very same time we have excessive inventory. And we have high expedite expenses and waste, overtimes, air freights. But the real problem is at a higher level. Many of you have heard of the bullwhip effect, originally called the Forrester effect. It's an extreme change in the supply position upstream in a supply chain, generated by a small change in demand downstream in the supply chain. And the transference and amplification of that variability goes from one end of your supply chain to the other and then back again. Now, I would love to tell you that we figured out how to eliminate variability. But what I can tell you is that we've figured out how to stop the amplification and transference of that variability. The more parts we have and the longer the supply chain is, the worse the effect. So what can we do? That's a great question. Thanks for asking. So demand driven MRP, what is it? The official definition has a lot of power in it. It is a method to model, plan, and manage supply chains with the focus on protecting and promoting flow of relevant information and materials. DDMRP uses strategic decoupling points, both to drive supply order generation, in other words, releasing of purchase orders and manufacturing orders, and the management of those orders, in other words, the rescheduling and the expediting throughout a supply chain. First articulated in 2011, like MRP, DDMRP was developed by people trying to solve a problem. And it was built on the pillars of material requirements planning, distribution requirements planning, lean, theory of constraints, Six Sigma, and these 4 pieces of innovation, which hopefully when we're done, you will see the power of those innovations. And we end up with position, protect, and pull as our mantra. So the 5 components of DDMRP fall into those categories of position, protect, and pull. The first one is all by itself, strategic decoupling. And there's an important word there, strategic. It does not mean inventory everywhere, and it doesn't mean random inventory. It means choosing the locations where we are going to hold inventory to decouple our supply chains or our processes. What happens is when we choose where to place that inventory, we essentially build a firewall that stops that transference and amplification of the bullwhip. Now, once we've chosen where we're going to hold inventory, now we need to figure out how much, and we do that through buffer profiles and levels. The buffer profiles contain things like, is it a manufactured or a purchase part? What's the lead time? Is it a long lead time or short lead time? How variable is it, right? And we put that all together, and that helps us figure out how much inventory we need to hold. The third step is dynamic adjustments. When we look at our usage, and if usage is creeping up or spiking or doing any other kinds of changes, we need to take that into account dynamically, automatically. We can't wait for someone to notice it and then try and react. We're managing way too many parts for that. Step number 4 is demand-driven planning. And this is in 4 and 5, we have some very key points here. But in number 4, I'll say this: nobody is using their MRP system, the reports out of their MRP system exactly as MRP tells you. We're dumping them into spreadsheets, we're making adjustments, we're looking ahead and saying, okay, it's telling me I need to order 50, but I can see ahead I'm going to need another 20, so I might as well change that to 70. Right? We are not using the system as it is presenting us our choices. We are having to manipulate that. Demand-driven planning says we have a system, and we're going to go through soon what that system is. You need to follow it. Now, don't throw out what you know, right? If you normally order 100 at a time and your system tells you need to order 10,000, something went wrong and you need to go figure it out. But generally speaking, you do what the system tells you to do because you've put all of your effort into the strategic decoupling, the buffer profiles and levels, and the dynamic adjustments. Therefore, now you can do what the system tells you to do. This is the planning section. Number 5 is visible and collaborative execution, right? MRP has a planning section. It makes recommendations as to what you should order and what new due dates you should put in play and what things you should change. It does not have execution built into it. DDMRP has execution built into it. And wouldn't it be cool if the people working on the shop floor could have a view of what's most important of the parts that run through their manufacturing cell. And you know, years ago, people would come to me and say, what do you think I should run this weekend? Well, they're asking me on a Thursday what they should run on a Saturday. Well, between Thursday and Friday, things have changed. So wouldn't it be cool if I could just give them access to either a spreadsheet or a screen in the system that would tell them at the moment they need to know what item is most important right now. So the innovations of DDMRP. Number one is decoupled lead time. And this is important because MRP understands only two types of lead time, either the manufactured or the purchasing lead time, depending on the type of the part, or the cumulative lead time. One is way too long, the other is way too short. And so we don't have the right lead time to tell our customers. DDMRP places decoupling points strategically in the product structure or routing. And the decoupling point is not new, right? It's been in the APICS dictionary for years. We just didn't apply it in the way that we're applying it here. So you can see in this example, SAA, PPX, and PPZ have buffers, and they're strategically stocked, and they are designed to always have inventory in those three positions. And we can see that if I always have inventory in those three positions, then I have 1 day for FPB plus 2 days for SAL. I have a 3-day lead time to make that part. If my customer is demanding a minimum of a 5-day lead time, I'm set. This is my structure. If they want a 2-day lead time, well, now I need to put a buffer at FPB. But I can mathematically tell where I need to place my buffers and where I need to work. So the placement of these decoupling points creates shorter independent lead time horizons. It's the longest, the decoupled lead time is the longest unprotected sequence in the item's lower level product structure legs. So you can see, for example, SAA has a decoupled lead time of 10, the 2 plus 8. SAG also a decoupled lead time of 10, 2 plus 8. And if I needed to understand, if, for example, SAG, once I put it together, was very complicated and complex, and so SAG, the value on SAG was very high, and the PPE and PPD were low, it might be to my benefit to put a buffer at PPE and PPD to reduce the size of the inventory I need at SAG. So what do we use the decoupled lead time for? Compress the lead times to market requirements. I kind of talked through that. If we take a 3-day lead time to make an FPB, is that good enough? Then that's where you stand. If, for example, what's our longest lead time here without any decoupling points? 16. So we have a 16-day lead time. If your customer is willing to wait 16 days or more, then you don't need DDMRP. You can function with MRP just fine until variability hits us, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We properly size the decoupling point buffers. In other words, lead time is one of the factors to determine how much inventory we are keeping at these decoupling points. And it helps us to find the high value inventory leverage points if we want to do additional decoupling. That's the example I gave. If SAG is very expensive, maybe we can buffer PPE to reduce the investment of SAG. Now, the second innovation is the net flow equation. 4 questions that every planner cares about each day. What is coming to me? What do I have? What demand do I need to fulfill immediately? And what future demand is relevant? The buffer status and the supply order generation occurs through a daily application of the net flow equation. What does that mean? We take our net flow equation, what do we have on hand, plus what we have on order, minus our qualified sales order demand. That gives us our net flow position. When we compare that to the buffer, we get our buffer status. And if our buffer status or our net flow position is in the yellow or red, we release an order up to the top of the buffer. Now, you probably have a question. What is qualified sales order demand? What we use for qualified demand is sales order amounts that are past due, due today, and any qualified spikes, which of course generates yet another question, what's a qualified spike? So the way we look for a qualified spike is we have an order spike horizon, which is a length of time in the future we're going to monitor, and an order spike threshold, which is a quantity in daily amounts that would qualify for it to be included in the net flow equation. So what we can see from this diagram is we have nothing past due. We have a number that is due today. And on day 3, we have a qualified spike. So we're going to include those two numbers in our net flow equation and see how it plays against the buffer. Here's the example. We have, and I don't go into this in this presentation, but the buffer has 3 different zones to it, red, yellow, and green. Each of them has a purpose, each of them has a reason, and each of them has a function. Different than safety stock, which typically might be an equation, but it's usually kind of a one thought process that gives you that number. There's many other differences with safety stock, but this is very cool because if I want to make a change in my normal order quantity, then I adjust the green zone. If I want to have a little more safety than the red zone is giving me today, then I adjust the red zone, et cetera, et cetera. But I digress. So here's an example. We have an on hand of 105. We have open supply or on order of 240. And we have a qualified demand of 20. So our net flow position, on hand plus on order minus the qualified demand, is 325. And we can see it is clearly in the yellow zone. And when it's in the yellow zone, what do? We place an order up to the top of the buffer. So the order recommendation is for 130. Hopefully that's clear to everybody. And it's elegantly simple as to how you place your orders, and understanding what is the meaning and the calculation behind each of those zones makes it much more clear as to why, in this case, 130 is my reasonable order quantity. So innovation number 3 is the decoupled explosion. And we all know about the requirements explosion, calculating demand for components of a parent item based on the bill of materials. Right? So what happens? In normal MRP, traditional MRP, we have an end item demand. And if that end item demand changes, it explodes through the entire bill of materials. And what happens? Everything in the bill changes. And when you look at this diagram, it's like, okay, well, it's 10, 12 parts, not a big deal. But not many of us are facing 12 parts in a bill of materials. So the other piece of it is the end item demand. The obvious one is the end item demand quantity changes. But what if the end item demand due date changes? We have the same problem. The due date or the quantity change. And what I like to say is if anything changes, everything changes. And that's why we spend the rest of the day trying to figure out what was all the impacts of that end item demand change. And when does MRP run? It runs overnight, right? So you can't automatically know. I don't know if any of you face this frustration. I used to face it where people would come to you and say, hey, I just got an order for 100 of these. Go figure out what all we need. Well, MRP runs, that tells me what I need. So we need to wait till tomorrow. Well, I've lost a day. I can't afford to lose a day. And the conversation gets heated real fast. In the decoupled explosion, right, we have placed decoupling points in strategic locations. And so when an end item demand changes, the explosion stops at each stock position, no matter what. Now, we talk about the rebuild zone, right? When we enter the yellow or the red and we have to place an order up to the top of green, that's the rebuild zone. So when those three strategic buffers enter the rebuild zone, in other words, their net flow position gets into the yellow or red, then the explosion continues, but not until then. So what happens is the chaos comes in smaller segments, and in fact, the buffers, the role of those strategic buffers is to absorb that variability and not change every single time that there's another change. Literally, this means independent dependence. Now, remember I said earlier, don't throw away MRP. MRP is not wrong. The world we live in has changed, so we have to adapt it. So in between the decoupling points, DDMRP explodes in the exact same manner as MRP. You can see in the highlighted blue squares, there's no buffers in there, so MRP is still functional. And in those scenarios, DDMRP still seeks to net to zero to have no inventory left. And the variability is absorbed in the buffered positions. But if you find, for example, that in one of those three spots, you're constantly being overrun, then that's a candidate for a buffer. And innovation number 4, planning and execution. I talked about this a little bit, that DDMRP separates planning and execution. But the innovation number 4 has to do with relative priority. DDMRP focuses on priority by buffer status as opposed to priority by due date. Now, what's the difference? Priority by due date, in this example, in the chart on the top right, shows two manufacturing orders due on May 12th, one on May 14th, and one on May 16th. If that is running through the same work cell, how do you choose between May 12th and May 12th? And which one do you do first? And how do you know? But let's look down at the buffer status priority. In our on-hand status box, we can see that MO 12401, manufacturing order 12401, has 12% of its buffer left. It is in the red zone. It is in trouble. That is a high priority. But oh my gosh, the due date was May 14th. So what we see here is, in fact, the 2 items due on May 12th were not as in bad a shape as the item due on May 14th. And one of the things about due date is once you set it, it isn't very long after you set it before it's not valid anymore. With all the changes and all the chaos we have, isn't it more important that I try and maintain the inventory levels that I've decided I need, right? In my strategically buffered pieces, 12% left, 27% left, 53% left, and 61% left. Now, don't throw away what you know. If you have a paint color sequence or an allergy sequence or a changeover sequence where it makes more sense to do them in a different order, you now have the information to be able to choose, do I do it in this order and eat the cost of the changeover or the setup? Or can I go look at that 12% in red and could I make it, based on what I know today, could I make it and follow the sequence as I really should follow? But you have the information to figure it out. Now, relative priority means that for each strategic position, we can get a quick sense of how critical is that part's position relative to its own buffer level. In other words, if we look at the one on the right, we have 12% remaining in our on-hand status. We have 12% of our buffer remaining. So we know it is very low when we compare it to where we want it to be in its own buffer. And the second piece is we can compare the part's position to all the other strategic items. So we know if we had 3 items that were at 5, 6, and 8%, well, that's the order in which we should be running those, most likely. Now, if we look at the purchase parts on the left-hand side, right, we have 6 different purchase parts, 5 of which are telling me to place an order, to release an order. If I am sending that order to the same company, what am I going to send them? Most likely, I'm going to send them 5 orders that are due on the same day. And they will have the same struggle that I would have, is if they're all due on the exact same day, how do I know which one to do first or second or third? But can you imagine the power if I could collaborate with my supplier, and for all the purchase parts from my supplier, I could send them this list. They would know what my priority is to keep me running. And now there's 2 pieces to this. You've got the planning side, which is the releasing of the orders, and then you've got the on-hand status or the execution side. And you could share that execution side as well with your suppliers, or if you have a manufacturing cell inside of your company and they make 6 different parts, giving them that information clearly says, here is the order we should run these in. Now, if you look at the sample on the right, if you're at 53% or 61% and it makes sense to run them the other way, you could probably make that decision as a shop floor employee. But if you want to run the 61% when the 12% is sitting up there in the red, we better have a conversation with more than just the people running the machine. So critical differences, MRP versus DDMRP. MRP has no decoupling. Everything is dependent, forces longer planning horizons, right? If you've got a total 40-day lead time, you have to look at that whole thing, and the variability accumulation. Every piece that has variability, it accumulates. DDMRP is strategically determined decoupling points, compresses the lead time, and absorbs the bidirectional variability. In other words, absorbs the bullwhip effect. MRP was not designed to manage stock positions. It was designed to be the perfect make-to-order calculator, and it nets to 0. But the world we live in today, very few of us can sell inventory that we don't have. DDMRP is designed specifically to manage strategic stock positions. It never nets to 0 at these points. In MRP, most conventional safety stock and reorder points are static. In DDMRP, the stock buffers are dynamically adjusted based on consumption and future known events. With MRP attempts to keep the full safety at all costs, which ends up being dead inventory and unnecessary expedites. What I like to say with MRP is safety stock. What's the difference between in MRP and the way MRP reacts when you hit safety stock or you hit 0? That's correct. There's no difference at all. So safety stock is the new 0. And what happens when you hit safety stock or you hit 0? All kinds of messages telling you you need to expedite. And if you're looking at 3 different parts for the day, that's fine. You can deal with that. But when you've got hundreds, if not thousands of parts you're managing, all of those messages that are telling you to put this one at the top of your list, when in fact it doesn't need to be at the top of the list, is another source of that chaos. So DDMRP assumes that the safety will be used frequently. It is normal to use the safety, and you'll see in another couple of slides that why that's important. With MRP, the fact that we're using forecasted demand signals guarantees the constant nervousness and expedites that we have. With DDMRP, supply order generation is tied directly to actual demand. There's no master production schedule or planned orders. It is all based on that net flow equation against the buffer. With MRP, we have priority by due date, and with DDMRP, we have priority by buffer status. So what we get to do is say goodbye to the bimodal distribution and hello, sunshine. Now, if you look at the chart on the bottom left here, it looks a lot like a statistical process control chart, doesn't it? And how cool would it be if we could look back at how our part was managed, the individual part? Were we in the red zone, the yellow zone, or the green zone? Was the action that we took, did it fix the problem or not? And when we can look back at history, we can tell fairly quickly whether or not what we did solved the problem, or do we have a hugely variable part, or do we have way too much inventory? And so DDMRP is proven to allow companies to plan and execute in the optimal range at strategically chosen points. And that means that we have protected flow. A couple of upcoming workshops, and you guys will get a PDF of these slides. Demand Driven S&OP Experience, that is a simulation program showing the new conversations that happen around sales and operations planning. We're doing that one online June 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. That's me along with Tracy Cheatham. And the Demand Driven Planner class, it's normally a 2-day in-person class. We're going to try and do 4 days in a row at 4 hours each day and try and do that one online as well. And here's how you stay in touch. A bunch of different ways to get in touch with me. Reach out to Chris and Dave at Central Iowa APICS. If any of this sounded interesting to you, love to have a further conversation. And hopefully when things get back to face-to-face meetings, hope to see you at one of the training sessions that we will certainly put together. Now, one of the questions that often comes up is, how do I get started? And this is, to me, one of the more interesting things. In the way MRP works today, we purchase the MRP system, and then we try and implement it, and then we figure out that we need training. With DDMRP, our suggestion is you go through the training first. Understand the magic that's happening, so you understand that there is no magic dust. Then prove it to yourself. Do a pilot. You can even do the equations in Excel if you really want to figure it out, just kind of see how it works. But you lose so much by only using Excel. But Excel will tell you if you can make it work in your business. And then you decide if software is appropriate for you. So you don't need software for this. You can implement these methodologies by using the exact same software that you have today. And with that, thank you very much for listening and for attending. And I'm going to unmute everybody if there's any questions. I don't see anything in the chat window. So if anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask away. I believe you can unmute yourself.